This is hashtag Africa. Hello and welcome. I'm Thulasizwe Simelane. Thank you for joining us. We start in Tunisia, where Parliament has adopted a new law criminalizing racist speech, incitement to hatred and discrimination. 125 members of Parliament voted for it, 1 against and 5 abstained. Under the new law, offenders can be jailed for 1 month and fined 1,000 dinars for using racist language. The vote has been hailed as historic. Let's move to Cameroon now, where the situation is tense following last weekend's elections. On Wednesday, members of the Constitutional Council deliberated on incoming election results and heard complaints from lawyers for opposition parties. Council members include high-ranking magistrates and members of 85-year-old President Paul Biya's administration. Biya has been in power since 1982. Results are expected later this month. And after a year in custody, Rwandan President Paul Kagame's critic, Diane Rwigara, has been released. She faces charges including forgery and inciting insurrection against the government. If convicted, Rwigara faces up to 15 years in prison. The human rights activist says after spending time in jail, she's now more determined than ever to make her voice heard. Zimbabwe is in economic crisis. The country is experiencing fuel and food shortages. Shops have been closed as a result, which has angered citizens. They've taken to the streets in protest. Africa analyst Edward Mitole joins us now to unpack the story a bit further. Edward, thank you so much for coming through and talking to me. So the government has been unveiling a number of interventions in Zimbabwe aimed at trying to strengthen the economy, which the government says is undervalued, and actually the GDP is worth far much more than what has been stated, but telling that to the people who are facing fuel shortages and the people who are doing panic buying in Zimbabwe. What is at the heart, in your understanding, of the latest crisis?
There is a disconnect between GDP and human development. So this has been proved time and time again throughout Africa. GDP measures the actual growth of the country. This is gross. It does not tell you the welfare of the people in the country. So if we rely on GDP figures, we will be misled because the people of Zimbabwe are still going through a crisis. Remember that there has been a change of government, a change of regime, but it was not really a change of regime because this happened internally. And nothing has changed. The system remains intact. The regime remains intact. The military junta remains intact. So it was orchestrated within the ZANU-PF to project to the world that the regime in Zimbabwe has changed. It is now working in the interest of the people, when in actual fact, it's the same military junta calling the shots in Zimbabwe. So the crisis in Zimbabwe must be viewed in this context, because the international community itself is also divided. The Washington Consensus, which dictates the terms when it comes to the running of the economy in the country, because remember that Africa still relies on the US dollar as the dominant foreign exchange. It is the ruling currency in Africa.
And part of the challenge in Zimbabwe has to do with that reliance on the US dollar vis-a-vis their own currency, which collapsed and was replaced by a pseudo currency called the Zimbabwe bond note.
Exactly. So you must understand that Zimbabwe is also suffering massive foreign exchange shortages. So the crisis in terms of fuel shortages should be viewed in that context, because if Zimbabwe doesn't have enough foreign exchange, it will not be able to import enough fuel to distribute it to the rest of the country. So these fuel shortages must be viewed in terms of how the economy is performing against other economies in the world. Remember that the sanctions are still intact. The United States has refused to remove sanctions on Zimbabwe
And
because it does not
Zidera
recognize the current regime.
Yeah.
It feels like there is nothing that has changed. While the rest of the world still recognizes the incumbent, Mnangagwa, the United States says, no, wait a minute. There is nothing that has changed here. So the sanctions are still intact.
And that is the extension of the so-called Zidera Act, Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which regulates what sanctions the U.S. maintains on Zimbabwe. Now, talk to me quickly about the situation, about how does Zimbabwe come out of this? They've had elections, and it seemed like President Mnangagwa was saying Zimbabwe is open for business, but things are pointing in a different direction. Solutions.
Kwame Nkrumah once said, Africa must unite or perish. Without genuine African unity, our continent will remain at the mercy of imperialist domination and exploitation. Today, I'll give you 10 simple yet profound reasons why Africa must unite or perish. Number one, Africa's wealth. Africa is extremely wealthy. Africa has got all the mineral resources that it needs, but these resources are not even distributed across the continent.
Distribution. Number two.
Number two, optimal market size. Africa has got a market. In fact, it has 1.3 billion people. Individually, the separate African nations will not present a market that can spearhead development.
Free trade area. Number three.
Number three, we need a common currency. We are relying on separate currencies that cannot compete with the US dollar. If we have an African currency, we will be able to come out of the situation whereby we will demand anyone outside Africa who wants to do business with us to trade with us in that single unit of account. So
basically, sum it up, because we will run out of time.
In summary,
yes,
Africa needs to unite. A unified African government buttressed by the strength of an all-African military high command will be able to compete with the global powers out there and will be able to determine its destiny. Remember that we are still divided. The balkanized African states individually cannot and do not have the bargaining power on the global stage.
All right, let's hold it there. Thank you so much. That is Africa analyst Edward Mitole giving us his sense of what are the solutions in as far as the crisis in Zimbabwe is concerned. When we continue, we'll tell you about a new technology that's helping in the fight against elephant poaching. Do stay with us.